You have until Friday to get your things out. This is my house now, and I don't need the constant reminder of my husband's first wife hanging around it. My stepmother Paulette said it 3 days after we buried my father, standing in the kitchen doorway of the house I'd grown up in, arms crossed, her voice carrying the specific, cold finality of someone who'd apparently been waiting years for the opportunity to say exactly that sentence. I stood there in my black funeral dress I hadn't yet changed out of, grief still raw and unprocessed, and felt something in me go very still. "Paulette, I don't think you understand something important," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This house isn't yours to give me an eviction date from. Don't be dramatic, Meredith. Your father and I have lived here for 12 years. I think I have a pretty clear understanding of whose house this is." I didn't argue further, not that afternoon. I simply nodded, gathered a few immediate belongings, and left, quietly, understanding, with a specific, grief-heavy clarity, exactly what I needed to do next. For days later, I walked into that same kitchen with my mother's attorney and a folder of documents that would completely, permanently change Paulette's understanding of exactly whose house she'd been living in. My name is Meredith. My biological mother, Elaine, passed away when I was 11, after a difficult, multi-year illness that I still, 20 years later, carry the specific weight of having witnessed as a child. The house I grew up in, a modest, well-kept colonial that had belonged to my mother's family for 3 generations, was legally protected for me, specifically, through a trust my mother established during the final years of her illness, understanding, with a mother's particular foresight, exactly what might happen to family property if my father ever remarried. My father, Walter, remarried Paulette 4 years after my mother's death, when I was 15. I want to be honest about our relationship over the following years. Never openly hostile, but never genuinely warm either. A careful, persistent coolness on Paulette's part that I'd always attributed to the ordinary complications of a blended family, never fully understanding, until that kitchen conversation, exactly how much resentment had apparently been quietly building underneath the surface for over a decade. My father continued living in that house with Paulette for the following 12 years, honoring, I now understand, an agreement he'd made with my mother's estate, that the family home would remain legally protected for me, regardless of his own remarriage, while still allowing him to live there for the remainder of his life. I want to describe what those 12 years actually looked like, because I think the specific, gradual erosion matters for understanding exactly how surprised I was, and wasn't, by Paulette's eviction announcement. Paulette never fully embraced this house as anything other than temporary. In her own mind, I think, small comments over the years about wanting to redecorate more completely, occasional, pointed remarks about how the house still carried too much of the past in it, a specific, persistent restlessness that I'd always understood, vaguely, as her wanting more ownership over the space, without fully realizing exactly how literally she meant that. My father never explained the full legal structure of the house to Paulette, a choice I've spent considerable time processing since his death. I think, honestly, he assumed there would be time, eventually, for a clearer conversation, that Paulette would simply understand, gradually, the specific arrangement he'd honored with my mother's memory, without it ever needing to become an urgent, explicit conversation. He never got that time. My father passed away suddenly, a heart attack at 68, 3 weeks before that kitchen conversation with Paulette, leaving behind a marriage where his second wife apparently had no real understanding of the legal reality underlying the home she'd lived in for over a decade. I want to describe the specific texture of those first difficult days after my father's death, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how disorienting Paulette's eviction announcement actually felt, arriving as it did in the middle of genuine, overwhelming grief. I'd spent those 3 days managing funeral arrangements largely alone, Paulette present but visibly distracted, occasionally short-tempered in ways I'd attributed, generously, to her own grief process rather than anything more calculated. I hadn't expected warmth from her during this period. Our relationship had never been warm. But I also hadn't expected the specific, cold efficiency of an eviction notice, delivered so soon after burying the man who'd connected us to each other in the first place. "I need you out by Friday," she'd said, and I remember standing there, genuinely uncertain, in that first moment, whether to correct her immediately or simply leave and handle the situation more carefully, once I'd had time to think clearly through my own grief. I chose to leave quietly that afternoon, understanding, even through the fog of fresh loss, that this particular situation required documentation and legal clarity, not an emotional confrontation in a kitchen still smelling faintly of the casseroles neighbors had brought over from my father's reception. I called my mother's longtime attorney, a careful, thorough man named Nathaniel Osei, the day after Paulette's eviction announcement, needing to understand exactly where I stood legally before I approached the situation any further. "I remember your mother's trust very well," Nathaniel told me, once I'd explained the situation. "Elaine was very deliberate about protecting that house for you specifically, understanding, even then, exactly the kind of situation that might eventually arise if your father remarried. I'd encourage you to come in as soon as possible. I want to walk you through the complete documentation clearly, so you understand your full legal standing before you have any further conversation with your stepmother." I met with Nathaniel the following morning, still processing the raw, disorienting grief of losing my father, now layered with the specific, surreal reality of needing to navigate a legal dispute over the house I'd grown up in, against the woman he'd spent the last 12 years of his life married to. "Your mother established an irrevocable trust in 2004, 3 years before her death," Nathaniel explained, walking me through documents I'd technically known existed but had never needed to fully examine until that exact moment. "The house was placed entirely within that trust, with you named as sole beneficiary, effective immediately upon her death. Your father was granted a specific, documented life estate, meaning he retained the right to live in the house for the remainder of his own life, but never held any ownership stake in the property itself. That life estate terminated automatically upon his death last week. Legally, Meredith, you've been the sole owner of that house for the past 20 years. Your stepmother has no legal claim to it whatsoever." I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and continued grief. Relief at understanding my legal position was completely secure, tangled together with a fresh wave of sadness at realizing exactly how much my father had apparently protected, quietly, for 2 decades, without ever fully explaining the arrangement to the woman who was now attempting to evict me from it. "Did Paulette know about any of this?" I asked. "Any of the trust structure, or the life estate arrangement?" "Based on what you're describing, it doesn't sound like she had a clear understanding of it," Nathaniel said carefully. "It's possible your father mentioned it to her at some point, in general terms, without her fully absorbing the legal significance. It's also possible he simply never had the difficult conversation directly, assuming, perhaps, that it would remain a non-issue for as long as he was alive to manage the situation himself. He didn't expect to die this suddenly," I said quietly, understanding, freshly, the specific tragedy of my father's assumption that he'd have more time to navigate this conversation properly. "No," Nathaniel agreed gently, "I don't think he did. Which leaves you in the position of needing to clarify this reality to your stepmother, during an already difficult time, rather than your father having the chance to do that clarifying himself, gradually, on his own terms. What are my actual options here?" I asked, needing concrete, practical guidance for how to move forward. "Legally, you have every right to ask Paulette to vacate the property, on whatever reasonable timeline you feel is appropriate given the circumstances," Nathaniel said. "You're under no legal obligation to allow her continued residence, though I understand this is a genuinely difficult situation, given the marriage she shared with your father and the complicated grief you're both navigating simultaneously. I'd recommend, at minimum, that we draft a clear, formal letter outlining the actual legal situation, giving her reasonable time to make alternative arrangements, rather than escalating immediately into a more adversarial eviction process." I appreciated that measured guidance, genuinely, even in the midst of Paulette's cold, immediate demand that I vacate within days. I found myself wanting to handle the actual situation with more grace and reasonable timeline than she'd extended to me. "I want to give her 30 days, I said. "I understand losing my father affected her too, regardless of everything else happening between us right now. I don't want to be needlessly cruel, even though she certainly wasn't extending me that same consideration." Nathaniel drafted the formal letter that same afternoon. Clear, precise legal language documenting the trust structure, the terminated life estate, and my request that Paulette vacate the property within 30 days, along with an offer to help coordinate the logistics of that transition as smoothly as reasonably possible. I want to describe what it felt like, holding that letter, understanding, with real clarity, exactly how thoroughly my mother had protected this house for me, 20 years earlier, during the final difficult months of her own illness, anticipating a future she wouldn't live to see, but preparing for it anyway, with a specific, careful foresight I hadn't fully appreciated until that exact moment. "Your mother really thought this through carefully," Nathaniel told me, as I prepared to leave his office. "I remember our conversations about this trust, back in 2004. She was very clear that she wanted you protected, specifically, regardless of whatever your father's life looked like after she was gone. I think she'd be proud of how you're handling this now, firm about your actual rights, but still extending real consideration to Paulette, even given how she initially handled this situation with you." I delivered the letter myself, 2 days later, driving back to the house I'd grown up in, understanding, with a specific, clarifying calm, exactly what I needed to say and exactly how the legal reality actually stood, regardless of whatever reaction Paulette might have to it. She opened the door already visibly annoyed, clearly expecting some continuation of our earlier, one-sided conversation about moving timelines. "I brought something you need to read," I said, handing her the sealed envelope. "I think it's important you understand the actual situation here, before we discuss anything further about the house." I watched Paulette's expression shift as she read through Nathaniel's careful, precise legal summary. Confusion first, then genuine alarm, then something sharper, more defensive, as the full weight of the situation apparently began landing. "This can't be right," she said, her voice carrying real distress now. "Your father never mentioned anything about a trust, or a life estate, or any of this. 12 years of marriage, Meredith, and he never once told me I didn't actually own any part of this house. I think that's a genuine failure on his part," I said honestly, "not telling you clearly, years ago, exactly how the house was legally structured. I understand that's difficult to process, especially now, on top of everything else you're grieving. But the legal reality is clear, regardless of what he did or didn't explain to you directly. This house has been mine, legally, since my mother's death 20 years ago. So what, you're just going to throw me out?" Paulette asked, her voice carrying a specific, bitter edge. "After 12 years of marriage to your father, in the house I've lived in and maintained this entire time? I gave you 30 days, I said. That's considerably more consideration than you gave me, 3 days after we buried him, when you told me I had until Friday to clear out my own mother's family home." Paulette didn't have an immediate response for that, and I watched something in her posture shift, the earlier defensiveness giving way, briefly, to something that looked almost like genuine shame. "I think I said that out of my own panic," she admitted, quietly. "I found out your father's will left most of our joint accounts in a more complicated structure than I expected, and I think I lashed out at you because you felt like the safest, most controllable target from my own fear about what was actually happening to my financial security after his death." I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something complicated shift in how I understood her earlier cruelty, not excused, exactly, but at least contextualized within her own fear and grief, rather than simply pure, uncomplicated malice. "I need you to understand something," I said. "I'm not trying to leave you with nothing, Paulette. I genuinely don't want that. But I do need you to understand and respect that this house is legally, permanently mine, in a way that predates our entire relationship by years. What happens next needs to be a real conversation about your actual options, not an assumption that you retain rights to a property you never legally held." "What are my actual options?" she asked, and I heard, for the first time in years, something genuine and vulnerable in her voice, rather than the careful, persistent coolness I'd grown accustomed to throughout our relationship. "I'm willing to help you find appropriate housing within your budget," I said. "I'm willing to give you more than the standard 30 days, if you need it, provided we're working together in good faith rather than continuing the kind of adversarial approach you started with 3 days after Dad's funeral. I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. I just need you to understand, clearly, that it's not actually your decision to make about whether I stay or go from my own mother's house." I want to describe the weeks that followed, because I think the specific, gradual shift in our dynamic mattered more than the initial, difficult confrontation. Paulette, once she genuinely absorbed the legal reality and moved past her initial panic and defensiveness, engaged with real, if somewhat reluctant, cooperation in finding alternative housing. "I think I owe you an actual apology," she told me, about 3 weeks after that difficult doorway conversation, both of us sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd originally delivered her eviction ultimatum. "Not just for the legal misunderstanding, but for how coldly I handled everything, right after we buried your father. I think I let my own fear and grief turn into something cruel, directed at you specifically, when you were grieving just as much as I was, if not more. I appreciate you saying that, I told her honestly. I don't think either of us handled this perfectly. I probably should have found a gentler way to deliver the legal reality, rather than simply handing you a formal letter through an attorney. I think we were both operating from a place of real fear and grief, even if it showed up differently for each of us. I want to describe the specific arrangement Paulette and I eventually worked out, because I think it represented something more nuanced than either the cold eviction she'd initially demanded or a simple, uncomplicated victory on my part. I helped her find a comfortable 2-bedroom condo about 15 minutes away, using part of my father's remaining estate, funds that were legitimately hers, separate from the house trust entirely, to cover a reasonable down payment, ensuring she had genuine, stable housing rather than simply being cast out with minimal support once the legal reality of the house became clear. I want you to know this isn't charity, I told her, as we finalized the details together. This is what Dad would have wanted, I think, making sure you're genuinely taken care of, even though the house itself was never actually his to give you claim over. I think you're right about that, she said. I think Walter would be genuinely disappointed in how I first handled this, honestly. I keep thinking about that, more than almost anything else. Not just the legal misunderstanding, but how quickly I turned cold toward you, right when we should have been grieving him together instead. I want to describe moving back into that house, once Paulette had fully relocated, because I think it mattered more than any single conversation in the entire process. I stood in my childhood bedroom, largely unchanged despite Paulette's 12 years of gradual redecoration throughout the rest of the house, and felt a specific, complicated grief settle over me, not just for my father, still raw and immediate, but for my mother too, understanding freshly, fully, exactly how much foresight and care she'd built into protecting this space for me, 20 years before I'd ever needed to actually claim it. I found, going through some of my father's remaining belongings in the garage, a small box of items that had apparently belonged to my mother, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, a handwritten letter addressed to me, dated the same year she'd established the trust protecting this house. My dearest Meredith, if you're reading this, it likely means I'm gone, and that circumstances have required you to claim the protection I built into this house for you. I want you to know I didn't do this out of any distrust toward your father, or any assumption that he'd remarry someone unkind. I did it because I understood, even in my illness, that life takes unexpected turns, and I wanted you to have one certain, unshakable piece of stability, regardless of whatever else might change in your life after I was gone. This house holds our family's history, 3 generations of it, and I wanted that history protected specifically for you. I hope, whenever you're reading this, that you're building a genuinely good life, filled with people who see you clearly and treat you with real care. I love you completely, always. Mom. I sat in that garage for a long time, holding my mother's letter, feeling 20 years of her careful protection finally, fully understood, layered now with the fresh grief of losing my father as well. Paulette and I have built something genuinely different in the months since, a careful, evolving relationship that carries little resemblance to the cold distance of our previous 12 years, or the sharp conflict of those first difficult days after my father's death. She visits occasionally now, for coffee, both of us slowly learning how to actually relate to each other honestly, without the specific, unspoken tension that had apparently been building underneath the surface of our relationship for over a decade. I think I spent years feeling like an outsider in this house, she told me, during one recent visit, even while living in it. I think that feeling made me act out of fear, right when your father died, rather than genuine cruelty. I'm not trying to excuse it. I just want you to understand where it actually came from. I think I understand that now, I told her. I think we both lost him at the same time, and neither of us handled that loss particularly gracefully, in those first difficult days. I'm glad we found our way to something more honest, even if it took an attorney's letter to actually get us here. It's been about 8 months now since that difficult kitchen conversation, and I've had real time to sit with everything that unfolded, the grief, the legal reckoning, and the slow, unexpected rebuilding of a relationship I genuinely thought might be permanently broken after those first cold, difficult days. I want to talk honestly about what this experience taught me. Paulette's initial cruelty came from a specific, real fear about her own financial security, colliding badly with fresh grief and my father's failure to ever fully explain the house's legal structure to her. That understanding doesn't excuse how she initially treated me, but it did help me eventually approach the situation with more grace than her first, cold ultimatum extended to me. My mother's foresight, 20 years before I ever needed to claim it, represents one of the most quietly remarkable acts of care I've encountered in my own life. She couldn't control what happened after her death, but she could make sure one specific, meaningful piece of stability remained genuinely protected for me, regardless of whatever else might change. I think there's real wisdom in that kind of careful, unglamorous planning, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply, quietly does its work exactly when it's needed most. I could have handled Paulette's eviction very differently, an immediate, adversarial legal response matching the coldness of her own initial ultimatum. I chose, instead, to combine firm legal clarity with genuine practical support, and I think that choice mattered enormously for how our relationship was ultimately able to heal, rather than remaining permanently fractured by the crisis. My father's failure to clearly explain the house's legal structure to Paulette, over 12 years of marriage, created a genuinely painful, avoidable crisis at the worst possible moment, right as we were both trying to grieve him. I think there's an important lesson in that, for anyone managing complicated family or estate arrangements, clarity, offered early and directly, however uncomfortable, tends to prevent far more pain than silence ever protects against. I extended Paulette real grace, eventually, once I understood the fear underlying her initial cruelty. I don't think that grace was owed to her, exactly. I think I chose to extend it because understanding the fuller context of someone's harmful behavior, even while holding them accountable for the actual harm, tends to open possibilities for repair that pure, uncomplicated anger simply can't access. I still live in that house today, my childhood bedroom slowly transformed into something more fully my own, my mother's careful protection finally, completely realized 20 years after she first put it in place. Paulette and I share coffee every few weeks now, building something genuinely new between us. Neither the cold distance of our earlier years nor the sharp conflict of those first difficult days after my father's death. I keep my mother's letter in the same drawer where I found it, rereading it occasionally, still moved, months later, by exactly how much careful, quiet foresight went into protecting this specific piece of stability for me, decades before I ever understood I might need it. Have you ever discovered, during a moment of real crisis, that someone who loved you had quietly protected your future long before you ever knew you'd need it? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, there's plenty more here to explore.